button. So you'll see a little red dot somewhere on your screen that lets you know we are recording. And with that, we will move on to slide number 1. So you are joining a class that's called Small Fruit for the Home Garden. My dear friend Sherry Frick, the ag agent in Allegany County, is going to be helping me present this class today. My name is Ashley Bodkins, and I am the Master Gardener Coordinator in Garrett County, Maryland. We both work for the University of Maryland Extension. And we do want to just welcome everybody to our class today, and thank you for attending. So just to let everyone know, University of Maryland Extension is a part of the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources with the higher umbrella of University of Maryland. So we always include this flow chart whenever we are chatting with folks, whenever we're going out to the community and doing classes. I am the Master Gardener Coordinator in Garrett County, and Miss Sherry, who she can wave if she wants to so everyone can see her. She is the Master Gardener Coordinator in Allegany County. So if anybody has questions about the Master Gardener program as we go along, please feel free to reach out and let us know. Some of the folks that we get to work with are on the call today, so some of them can also jump in with the chat if you have any questions or want to speak with the Master Gardener. But the program is all based on folks that are interested in teaching other people about home horticulture. And if you are interested in doing that, we ask folks to do a 40-hour basic training class that's all based on in-classroom, kind of like PowerPoint lectures. And then we do ask you to do 40 hours of volunteer service. After you do both of those requirements, you can be a certified Maryland Master Gardener. And most other states in the United States and other places in the world also have similar programs. So it's a really nice opportunity to get volunteer service and to teach folks about home gardening and that sort of thing, if that's your passion. Okay, so we are currently up to 109 folks on the call today, and I think that's a great reason or a great way to let people know that this is a really important topic right now. Growing your own fruits and vegetables is more important than ever, and small fruits especially are an easy way for you to get some really nutritious vegetables or really nutritious food into your diet. They're really high in flavor and high quality whenever you get them right out of your own backyard. So, growing them or adding them to your garden is something that's really, really easy to do. And we're going to talk about a couple of different things that you can grow easily and quickly. Usually within 2 years, you can usually be getting a lot of these small fruits once you get them started in your garden. Okay, so today these slides are mainly tailored to Maryland, but we put a lot of general information in here for everyone that's joining us. But some of the major tree fruits that are grown here in Maryland would be apples and pears and peaches and plums and even cherries. So we're not going to be talking anything about fruit trees today or tree fruit. We're going to be mainly focusing on what we consider these small fruits. So for today, we're going to be covering strawberries, blackberries, raspberries, currants, grapes, blueberries, and elderberries. All right. So one thing that we are really fortunate here in the western part of Garrett County is that we do get a lot of cool weather. And a lot of the small fruits and even some of the tree fruits, they actually require a certain amount of cold hours in order to initiate fruiting. So I really like this chart. It tells you how many hours are required in order for your fruit to come out of hibernation. Okay, so once the plants reach the required amount of hours of coolness, and the coolness is anywhere between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So once those these fruit trees or canes or plants reach that certain cooling temperature, certain hours of cooling, that's when they will begin to break dormancy and come out of dormancy. So um, knowing this information can kind of be helpful, because if you live in an area where you don't have any coolness, none of this 32 to 45 degree temperature, it can be a problem, and you wouldn't want to plant certain ones of these small fruits. So for example, peaches, they need anywhere between 600 and 800 hours between 32 and 45 degrees. So just think about that. This is a really good chart to help you keep that all straight. Things like blackberries, they only need 200 to 500 hours. Things like citrus, which makes sense because they're mostly grown in the southern United States, they don't need any hours of cooling. So that's a good reason that we grow them in places like Florida and in California and things like that. So keep this in mind. We won't be coming back to this too much when we talk about the individual fruits, but just know that we are going to send the PowerPoint slides out to everyone that attends today as a PDF file. So later this afternoon or early tomorrow, we'll be sure and get you guys each a copy of the slides so you'll have them for your notes, okay? All right, so I just wanted to talk a couple minutes about picking different cultivars. I'm sure most of you have seen different fruit catalogs or seed catalogs that offer small fruits being sold as either bare root plants or maybe even in containers. But knowing what zone you live in is going to be really helpful in deciding what plants you can grow. So I'm going to skip down to this next slide, jump around here a little bit, but this is a map that shows us the United States Department of Agriculture has a cold hardiness zone map, or a plant hardiness zone map. So if you go to this website here at the bottom of the slide, again, you're going to get a copy of these slides, so you can just click on it once you get your PDF version, or you can always just use a search engine, but you can actually enter your zip code, and it'll tell you exactly what zone you live in. So I always tell folks it's really helpful to know that whenever you're planting any type of perennials, particularly fruit trees or small fruit. This is the specific map for Maryland, and I always tell folks you have to be really careful because a lot of times you'll get those catalogs that say, this plant is perfect for Maryland. And if you can look at this example, Maryland has a whole wide range of cold hardiness zones. So it goes everywhere from over here on the coast, where it's an 8A, to up here in the mountains where I live, where it's a 5B. And I always say that if you can go a zone colder, do that. So if your cold hardiness zone is a 5B, if you can go up to a 5 or even a 4, that's going to make sure that you don't have any issues with your plants freezing out and you losing that investment that you just made. Okay, so back up here real quick. I did want to make sure that folks did always pay attention to selecting cultivars that are going to have good disease resistance, as we researchers and things like that learn more about these plant diseases and breeding them. The more disease resistance you can get in a plant, the better, the less headaches you're going to have. So less headaches as a gardener always means happier gardening and less stress. So we try to do all that we can to ensure that we can have really good quality plants. Be sure that a lot of times you can get bare root plants a little bit cheaper than container plants, and for me, if I save money on one plant, that means that I could, buy a second plant. So remember that bare root plants, they will catch up to your container grown plants within the first season usually, especially if you can give them the care that they need in proper planting, okay? And if your plants would arrive too early for planting, just remember to make sure you keep the roots moist, okay, so not soggy. You don't want them to be sitting in water, but you do want to keep them nice and moist, and make sure you keep them cool. So if they're small plants like You know, strawberries or something like that that would fit in your refrigerator crisper. That's the perfect place to store them. Or just in an unheated garage, that works well too. So just remember that. Okay, so I'm going to turn the reins over to Miss Sherry Frick to talk to you guys a little bit about the specifics of growing strawberries. And then we're going to be going back and forth as we go through the specifics of each of the rest of these fruits. So, Miss Sherry?
Okay, thanks, Ashley. So I'm going to talk about strawberries. And as you can see from the picture on your screen, we have first we see that strawberries are aggregate fruits. They're kind of odd in the fruit world. They have many stamens and pistils, and they're one of the few fruits that have all their seeds on the outside, which is kind of strange. And you may have heard reference to a king berry before, and what that is, that's the first fruit to ripen on a fruit truss, and it's usually the largest one on your plant. Now with strawberries, you're going to hear terms like June bearing and ever bearing. And Ashley, does the next slide talk about them in particular? We'll go ahead to the next slide then. So with June bearers, basically they bear once, and they bear a nice heavy crop, and that's going to be in May and June. And then the rest of the year, they spend their time putting out runners and growing leaves, so it's more vegetative growth. And we call them short day plants, and when you have less than 14 hours of sunlight and less than 60 degrees, usually it's in the fall, that's when these plants will put energy into creating buds from which you're going to have flowers for the next spring. So your flowers are being formed mostly in the fall. You might get a little bit of that happens in March, but for the most part, that's happening in the fall with June bearers. And most of the time, producers are going to use June bearers on the East Coast, more so than on the West Coast. All right, so now we're going to talk about ever-bearing strawberries. It might be a little bit confusing here. Everbearers basically produce flower buds regardless of the length of the day, okay? Now, everbearers bear anywhere from 2 to 3 times in a growing season. Day neutrals are basically cultivars of everbearers. So they have been developed from everbearers so that they basically are producing fruit continually from the time that they come out of dormancy until frost. So you're going to see fruit bearing on it. You can be in drips and drabs, you know, June through frost. So depending where you are, you're mid-October, maybe even November 1st. So with everbearers, you may get some like heavy crops at certain times of the year, and then you just kind of have little bits here and there. So your first heavy bearing is probably going to be around July 4th, and then it's depending on the temperatures in the summer. If it's real hot, you're not going to get as good a fruit production. It actually inhibits fruit production. So then you might see another really a much heavier crop in the fall, say September or October. Okay. Let's see. And these are usually mostly used by producers in California, but you know, some folks here on the East Coast do grow them. We have some growers in Garrett County that grow them because they prefer cooler temperatures, and Garrett County is pretty good for that. Okay, so now here you see we have a nice diagram of a strawberry plant. And as you look at it, you'll notice a term here. It says the crown. Now that's the area of vegetative growth from which you're going to get your stems forming your leaves, your flower trusses, and then you'll see stolons here, or runners. So this is the way that the strawberry plant makes more of itself vegetatively. The mother plant will put off these stolons, and at the end of the stolon, you'll see we have a little baby plant starting. And if you were to examine that and you turned it over, you would see like, it looks like an elbow at the bottom of that stolon, and you'll see little nubs where the roots are going to start coming out. And as the plant produces these stolons, they're producing plants that are genetically identical to themselves, because these are not sexually reproduced, they are asexually reproduced. And you'll also notice that with this plant you have actual flower trusses, and these are specialized parts of the plant that produce the flowers and the fruit. And one thing I want to mention here is when you do buy strawberries, a lot of time you're going to get them as bare root plants, and they can actually take a lot of abuse. You can trim the roots back, at least make sure you have maybe at least 6 inches on the roots, but they can be, you know, treated kind of harshly. I used to plant them in cell trays, and the cell trays really weren't that deep, and we would get the bare roots and trim off a good bit of the roots and then put them in the cell trays, and they do just fine. But when you do go to plant them, please make sure that you are not burying the crown. Okay, the crown should be sitting at the level of the soil. The plant doesn't like it so very much if you bury the crown. So that's just a word of caution there. Okay, Ashley, next slide, please. Okay, so now you see a nice picture of strawberry in plasticulture. So this is, this is how a producer would grow strawberries. A plasticulture has a lot of benefits to it. In a system like this, you would have drip tape that goes underneath of the plastic, and then holes are placed in that plastic, and then you put your plug plant inside those holes. So for day neutral strawberries, you're going to be planting them about a foot apart, in 2 rows along about a 3-foot wide row, and your plants are going to be kind of staggered, so they're not right next to each other. With June berries, generally they're grown in a matted row system, and we generally plant them about 18 inches apart. And something I should mention with June berries is the first year that you put them in, if you put them in the spring, you're not going to get fruit that year, because you should be taking the flowers off of your spring, your June bearing plants. And then that summer is going to be a time of vegetative growth for your June bearers, and they're going to put out a lot of runners and start new plants. Okay, but here you see, I think most likely is a day neutral strawberry system, and so that's a good one there. All right, so for site, soil, and culture on your strawberries, there's many different ways to start growing strawberries. So we can talk about the best case scenario to give your plants the best chance possible. And that would be to prepare your soil the fall before you intend to plant your strawberries. So that's going to entail killing off your sod, which you can do, with Roundup, or you could cover the area that you want to grow in with cardboard or plastic and kill the sod that way. And then you can turn the soil over. And if you do that before winter, you're not going to want to leave your soil bare. You're going to want to cover that, whether you do that with a layer of straw or some other kind of mulch, or you could plant some kind of a cover crop like a winter wheat or oats, which is a good one because it will winter kill, and then you don't have to turn it over in the spring. If you have winter wheat or rye and you plant that, you will have to turn that over in the spring, but it's good because it's going to be adding organic matter to your soil, which will be very helpful for your strawberry plants. And you need to turn that over probably at least 3 weeks before you plan to plant your strawberries. Okay, so just some other basics. Once you've got your soil ready to go, you can plant your bare roots. You can do that in the spring. Sometime in April would be good. And generally from the time you plant a strawberry bare root plant, it takes about 2 months before you'll see fruit, if it's a day neutral. Okay, so they also like ammonium, so you're going to want to top dress with ammonium nitrate and about 3 pounds of ammonium nitrate per 100 foot of row. And that you would do that in late August in preparation for planting in the spring. And then after you plant them, you want to um, put a balanced fertilizer on them as soon as they start to be putting out flowers. Okay, as far as care in the winter time, you're going to want to protect your strawberry plants, and you can do that by putting a mulch on it of straw. Should be several inches thick, and a guide here would be 1 bale of straw per 1,000 square feet. Okay, and you'll want to put that down after your hard frost, okay, or a freeze. That's when the plants are going to go dormant, and that's when you can safely put the mulch on. And then in the spring, you're going to want to rake that straw mulch off, probably sometime mid-March perhaps, because you don't want to leave a heavy layer of mulch on top, or else your plants will die. Now, after you remove that mulch and you have the strawberry flowers start to form, and you're going to get some cold temperatures, say below 28 degrees, and you want to protect those blooms so they don't frost it and die, you'll probably want to put some kind of a row cover on there as a frost protection. And that kind of a row cover would be about 1 ounce per yard, the thickness of that kind of row cover. Okay, so you can buy at some kind of a nursery or online. Okay, the other thing with strawberries are they tend to play out after 3 to 4 years. You're probably going to need to renovate your strawberry plants every 2 years if you want to have higher production. And part of the reason for this is that as your plants get older, they produce more crowns. And the more crowns you have, the smaller your strawberries get. So if you don't renovate your plants, either by replacing them, you can replace them with daughter plants, or you can buy new plants. But if you don't reduce the amount of crowns, eventually your strawberries aren't going to produce much at all. Okay, go ahead and next slide, please, Ashley. Okay, sorry, didn't notice that it was changed, the same color in the background. All right, so your soil should be nice and well draining. They need to be in full sun. And we already talked about how to prepare the soil, so I won't go over that again. And with June bears, you're going to find that you have like a 3-week window from where you are, could expect to be picking fruit, and then that plant's done. Whereas with the everbearers or the day neutral, they're bearing, bit by bit over the entire summer season. And some varieties of strawberries that we could suggest, and these are day neutrals, would be Seascape. That's a good all-around strawberry. It's firm, it's got fairly good flavor and disease resistance. It gets pretty good production per plant. It's a medium size. And then the next one that we suggest, I believe, is Albion. Would be the next slide. That is also a day neutral strawberry. You can get some really large fruit with Albion, although I have found in planting it in Garrett County that you need to be careful with your water and your nutrient management with this one. It does require, constant water and also a good nutrition program. Make sure you're continually making sure it's getting enough nitrogen. And I just want to say, I don't have any slides for this, but some good June bearers for you to try would be Jewel or Sparkle, got Cabot and Chandler are a few that I can think of. Those are some good varieties to try. So I'm going to hand it over to Ashley.
All right, so we're going to move right along into raspberries. So we have a lot of information on raspberries. They're a fun one to try. Some of this gets a little bit complicated, so I'm going to try to go over this and make it as clear as we can. So the scientific genus and species for a raspberry is Rubus idius. And they are a bramble fruit, which are made up of many aggregates, fruits that are made up from drupelets. So all the little individual sections or seeds are parts of that flower that have to be pollinated. Okay, so raspberries, they can be, the fruit is either produced on an annual or a biennial cane. So we're going to get into this, and this is where it gets a little bit complicated. Um, but in general, raspberries, they have a perennial crown. So once you plant raspberries, that plant is going to be there for many, many, many years. The parts that come up off of the perennial crown or the perennial root are going to be what we call canes. So if it's the very first year that that cane comes up from the root, that's when it's called a primocane. And then the second year that that cane is still there, that's when it becomes a floricane. So these are some terminology that you're going to need to know whenever we talk about pruning and managing your raspberries. But in general, we can define them into two different categories. We have June or spring bearing, and then we also have primocane or fall bearing. So that's going to be important when you're going to pick different varieties of raspberries if you're just starting a raspberry patch at your home. Okay, and raspberries do require some amount of coolness. So be sure that, you know, if you're in a place that doesn't have any of that 35 to 42 degree weather, that you probably aren't going to be able to grow raspberries very successfully. Okay, so we're going to talk about some general characteristics just about raspberries. In general, they are very shallow rooted. The majority of the roots are going to be in that first top 10 inches of soil. So having a really nice deep topsoil is going to make them very fertile. The shoots and roots are sensitive to high temperatures. So again, you don't want to plant them in a place where you have a lot of really hot weather. And again, the optimal leaf temperatures are somewhere around 70 degrees. If it gets much higher than that, they're not going to be happy. Now, I do have raspberries in my high tunnel, and they seem to do pretty good. Again, where I live, we don't have extremely hot weather very often. But if you are thinking about putting them in any type of greenhouse or tunnel, just be sure to know that that could be a limiting factor in the production. Okay, they do have perfect self-pollinated flowers. So despite what you may believe, insects are not needed in order to get raspberries. So that's kind of nice. That does not mean that you will not have insects or bees on them, though, because it's said that they have the sweetest nectar. And I know that every year that's where my honeybees flock to, and that's where especially I see a lot of like wasps and yellow jackets and that sort of thing on my raspberry flowers. So just a word of caution, you don't maybe want to put raspberries right along a walkway or something like that, because it could be a place that's going to attract some of those stinging insects that might not be ideal for visitors as they come up to your home. Okay, so we're going to break down the difference between the spring bearing versus the primocane or fall bearing. So with your spring bearing, the very first canes that come out of the soil that year are not going to give you fruit. With the spring bearing, you're going to have to wait until the next season to actually get flowers and then fruit on that cane. So it's kind of like a 2-year system. A lot of times with spring bearing raspberries, we recommend that you have a trellis system. And so for all of your primocanes, you take to like the right, and then the next year, when they become floricanes, all of them will be on one side and producing, and then the following year, the primocanes, as they come up, you would take to the opposite side. So every year you're going to kind of be pulling them to different sides. After you get flowers and fruit off of your floricanes, you can actually cut them back to the ground to make managing a little bit easier. Okay. So on the contrary, with your fall-bearing raspberries, these are actually going to produce fruit for you the very first season. So hopefully the first season that you would plant your perennial crown or your roots, the very first year that you plant them would be the first year that you would also be able to harvest, because fall bearing raspberries are going to produce flowers and fruit on that very first year of growth. So I like fall bearing raspberries. You can also manage them where you cut them down to the ground each season because you're going to get a new shoot the next year. So it makes managing a little bit easier and cleaner. If you want to double the amount of time that you get fruit, you can leave the primocanes until the next season and only cut them back halfway. And then the little shoots that come off of there will be floricanes the second season, and you'll actually get fruit a little bit earlier. So it gets a little bit complicated with raspberries. But the good news is that once you know that there are two different varieties, fall bearing versus spring bearing, you can do a little bit more research and kind of figure out, what's going to work the best for your situation and what you're looking to do. So one of my favorite varieties that I planted in my tunnel probably 3 years ago was called Joan J, and I actually got them from a source, Norse Farms, and I have the slide up here for you to see. My favorite thing about these Joan J raspberries are that they are, you can see here, they are fall bearing. So I can cut them down to the ground each season in my tunnel and get rid of all the canes if I want to. And the other thing that I really like about them is that they are thornless. So there's absolutely no thorns that you have to worry about. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and that's really a nice thing to have for when she's trying to pick them and get her berries. So that's just one variety that I have experience with that I really think they've done really quite well for me. So lots and lots of different varieties. We're going to talk a little bit more about managing them. So these are some examples of shoots as they're coming up out of the ground. A lot of times your shoots are going to be, your primocanes are going to have a little bit of a different color to them. So you can kind of give you a little bit of a clue about which ones are primocanes if you didn't mark them last season. They're going to be a little bit more herbaceous and not quite as woody. Okay. So some ways that you can get new raspberries. This is what they call a tip rooting. So if you've ever had a raspberry that's fallen down to the ground and you didn't mow it off or something like that, as soil washes over top of it, or just as it gets a little bit of moisture there on the soil, it will actually form roots and get you a whole new plant. So then you can cut off the cane from the mother plant, and you'll have a brand new plant that you could share with a friend or a family member, or plant back in your hedgerow. I do really recommend the bottom picture there on your left, landscape fabric. That can really help suppress weeds. And if you've ever done much with raspberries, you may already know this, but they get a lot of suckers coming off those perennial canes or the perennial roots. So that's a really good thing if you're trying to get a lot of fruit, but they can kind of get a little unruly and they can end up in your rose bed or whatever may be growing nearby, or even in your yard. So just be ready for those suckers. They're an exact clone of the parent. So feel free to, again, dig them up and share with a friend or family member, but they can be a little bit overwhelming if you don't want all of those. Okay, Miss Sherry, I'm going to turn it back over to you for a little bit about blackberries, and then we'll talk about some of the problems that we see on both these bramble fruits.
Sure. And Ashley, I was taking a look at the chat, and somebody was asking about how to get Japanese beetles off your plants. So I wrote something in there. So if you're interested, take a look at that. And also, people are interested in whether or not they can grow these things in pots. So my answer to you is you can grow just about anything in a pot as long as it's large enough to support the root system of the plant. So I used to work for a strawberry and raspberry breeding company, and we grew everything in pots. We have blackberries, raspberries, blueberries, strawberries, all in pots. So yes, you can do it, but you have to water more frequently, and you have to fertilize more frequently because you're washing the soil every day, water running through it. So you just have to keep up with it a little more than you would if it's in the ground, and make sure it's got full sun. Okay, so moving on to blackberries. I'm going to tell you what, these are some of the meanest plants I've had to tangle with inside of a greenhouse. If you get the ones with thorns, they can be quite brutal and painful. That's why I think a lot of people have moved to thornless blackberries, and there are quite a lot of cultivars out there that are thornless. Now, you will hear people say that the thorned ones are tastier than the ones without thorns, and I think there's something to that. But they are perennial plants, and in general, the fruit is born on second year or second growth season canes, on 2-year-old canes, okay? Now, they're very well adapted to all parts of Maryland. And then, so you've got all kinds of varieties and permutations of blackberries. You can get thorny erect plants. You can get thornless trailing blackberries. You can get thornless erect blackberries. And now, in the last few years, I think it's the University of Arkansas has developed a blackberry that produces fruit on 1-year-old canes, on the canes that were produced that first season. So basically, on those particular blackberry varieties, they produce the cane that first summer, and at the end of the summer, you get fruit, which is a new thing for blackberries. Okay, so some recommended erect thornless blackberries would be Apache, Navajo, Arapaho, Ouachita is also a good one. So let's see, I believe the Arapaho ripens earliest, and then you have Apache and then Navajo. And if you want to extend your season of harvesting fruit, and this applies across all these fruits, you'll find that there are varieties that bear early, some mid-season, and some late season. So get a few of each, right? So then you're extending your season of fruit collection over a longer period. So you can do that with blackberries. And then we have anything that says prime. Those are the ones that are bearing fruit on the primocanes, or the first year cane. So you've got prime Jim, prime Jan, and prime Arc, but they have thorns. Now, if you want a primocane variety that is thornless and it's bearing fruit on the first year canes, then that would be prime Arc Freedom. Okay, would be your thornless variety of that. Okay, I think I've explained that. We can go to the next slide. Is there another one for blackberries? Nope. Okay, so we're gonna move on to problems that you may have with brambles.
Okay, thank you, Sherry. So we just, every plant or every fruit seems to have some sort of issue, but we just wanted to mention a couple of the real common ones that we see. So one of them that we usually see on blackberries would be this orange rust fungal disease. So if you see something like this showing up, there's not a whole lot you can do for it other than to cut it back. So just be forewarned that it is out there. The one in the middle of the picture you see is a cane borer, so you can see where the stem has been damaged by this borer, and it's actually probably still inside of there. And the one that we see very commonly, especially here in Garrett County, where we get a lot of precipitation, would be this botrytis or gray mold. Again, not a whole lot that you can do about it, but just be forewarned, you should get rid of anything that's infected, anything that falls off. Don't leave any of your infected fruits like at the base of your plant. You should get rid of them completely, because if you just leave them at the base of the plant, it's just going to be the inoculum for it to happen again. We already kind of addressed this in the chat box. Thank you, Sherry. But one of the main insect problems that we see are Japanese beetles. They love anything in this rubus family, as well as apples and grapes, and I've even had them like on my currant bushes as well, if they're desperate. So one really easy way to get rid of the Japanese beetles is just to pop them into a bucket of soapy water. So just like Dawn dishwashing liquid in a bucket of water, warm water, knock them in there, and that'll kill them pretty quickly. And it takes a lot of hand picking to do that, but luckily these little critters, they fall off very easily. Left unchecked though, they can do a lot of damage really, really quickly. And I believe Sherry did put in the chat that you can use a product called Milky Spore that actually goes onto your lawn that actually kills the Japanese beetle grubs. The not so great part about that is that it's not going to help you this season. It would be a solution for future years. So don't forget that, you know, not everything is instantaneous. So sometimes we have to do things in our garden this year that's going to help to benefit us, you know, in the future. The last one I have for you is a new invasive fruit fly that's called the spotted wing Drosophila. This is a big problem for folks that are growing raspberries and bramble crops on a large scale. So the thing that makes this fruit fly really hard to deal with is that it can actually penetrate unripe fruit and lay its eggs in. So then once your fruit develops, you have these unfortunate little larvae that are in there eating it. So they get really mushy and it can be a real problem for professional growers. We don't see this a whole lot in backyards. Again, sanitation is your best bet, making sure that you don't have a lot of your fruit, if it would fall off and you wouldn't harvest it, make sure you don't leave it, you know, at the base of your plants or anything. This pest again is named, rightly so, spotted wing, because they do have little black spots on their wings. Again, it's a fruit fly, so it's a very small. So, you know, you're not going to see them flying around like a bee or something like that. They're very tiny, like a gnat. And if you do want to monitor and see if you do have this issue, this is a really easy way to make a homemade trap. A clear container, this looks like a peanut container, and you just put active yeast and water, and that'll attract them right in there.
Okay. They will come up onto your deck or your patio in order to get what it is you have there.
I'm not sure. I think we're getting some feedback there. Sorry about that. So if you guys have any questions about those bramble pests, please feel free to put them in the chat. Either way, we are going to move on to blueberries with Miss Sherry.
Okay, blueberries. I think this is probably one of the small fruits that people have the most trouble with. And part of the pH requirements that this plant has. So go ahead, Ashley. The next slide. Oh, I'm not muted. Okay. Am I muted, Ashley? Go ahead, Ashley, with the next slide. Okay, so first of all, I talk about there's 3 main varieties of blueberries, and you may or may not be familiar with them. Probably the most commonly planted blueberry in our gardens is the Highbush Blueberry. There are also there's the common lowbush blueberry, which is more suited to northern colder climates. And for the mid-Atlantic, we would be planting the Highbush Blueberry. And then for your southern regions, which are, you know, hotter, you would want to be planting the rabbit eye blueberry, and it is good in zones 7 to 9. Okay, go ahead, Ashley, with the next slide. So some of the basic characteristics of the blueberry is it's a perennial shrub with a shallow root system and has woody canes that originate from the crown. And a mature shrub is going to have anywhere from 15 to 18 canes. And fruit is usually born on buds formed the previous growing season. So you're going to be careful with pruning that you're not cutting out, you know, your fruiting wood. Generally, they're pretty cold tolerant, especially the Highbush blueberry and the lowbush blueberry. Go ahead with the next slide. I think the next slide we're going to talk about a little bit of the history of blueberries. It's been cultivated, the Highbush blueberry which is the prime, blueberry shrub that, growers, producers use to produce blueberries for like the last 70 or 80 years. And it originated from the plants found in southern New Jersey, which, if you're familiar with that area, the soil is very light and sandy, a little bit acidic and high in organic matter. So that's what this plant is adapted to. So if you have heavy clayey soils, this plant is not going to do real well. So you're going to have to amend your soil. Also, it's amended to it likes to have a pH of between 4.5 and 5, which is very acidic. I would say if you do a soil test, in general, you're going to find your soils are somewhere in the 6 range, okay? So I think it's really important that if you're going to try and grow blueberries, that you get a soil test and you see what your pH is, because more than likely you're going to have to adjust it and make it more acidic than it actually is. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. Okay, so breeders went ahead and they found plants in New Jersey, and that's where we get most of our plants from. And another interesting thing about these Highbush blueberries is that they don't have root hairs on their roots. They have feeder roots, but no root hairs. And this makes them very sensitive to water levels. So they don't like the soil too wet and they don't like it too dry. Okay, so you have to be careful with blueberries with that. You make sure that you have a steady supply of water to them. You have the right pH, and you have light soil for them to grow in. Okay, so they prefer sandy loams, and of course they need to be, the best is in full sun, although I think the low bush blueberry could take some shade. And you can amend your soils to bring them down to the correct pH using either sulfur or iron sulfate. And clayey soils, at the time of planting, you can add peat moss. So you can go to the next slide, Ashley. Okay, so when you go to plant your blueberries, I think the most important thing is that the root system is not necessarily deep, but it is going to be wider. It's a shallower root system. So what you should do is take a look at your plant, look at the root ball, and you want the root ball, the hole, to be the same depth as how deep your root ball is, okay? It doesn't need to be deeper than that. But what you need to do is broaden the hole, okay? So you want to make the hole about 2 times the width of your blueberry root ball. And then you want to take some of your native soil and then maybe half native soil and then half peat moss. Make sure your peat moss is has already been wet down and it has soaked up a bunch of water, and you mix that in with your native soil in the hole. And that's naturally going to help bring the pH down, because peat moss by itself has a pH, I think, of 4. So that's going to help with getting your pH right. So as I mentioned, you can use iron sulfate or sulfur to bring down your pH. Sulfur is very potent, okay? And if you're gonna, and it's a powder, you're gonna need to protect yourself when you use it, and you only need very small amount of that. And also, you're not gonna see results for about 6 months if you add iron sulfate or sulfur. So it's suggested that you add a half a pound of sulfur per 1,000 square feet. So that tells you that you don't need very much of this. Now, when you do your soil test, you're going to get the report back. And if you look on the left-hand column there, you'll see you have your present pH. So let's say your present pH of your soil comes back as a 6.5, and you want to lower it to 4.5. Well, if you follow the chart, you look at the top line and you go all the way over to the right, you see 4.5. So you look over from 6.5 and come down from 4.5, and you'll see that you need 0.4 pounds of sulfur per 10 square feet, which would basically be the planting area of your blueberry bush. So that this is a handy dandy chart to give you an idea of how to bring that pH down. And one other thing to consider is that if you use iron sulfate is less potent, and you would need 8 times the amount of iron sulfate as you would of pure sulfur, but iron sulfate is probably easier to work with. Okay, so there are 7 species of blueberries native to Maryland, and we don't suggest you try and dig them up, but go online or go to your local nursery and find some good blueberry plant cultivated ones that you can use. And I know some people wonder, what's the difference between a blueberry and a huckleberry? Well, a huckleberry has 10 seeds, and if you're eating that berry, you can feel them in your mouth, whereas a blueberry has many, many seeds. Okay, go ahead, Ashley, with the next one.
Okay. I was just monitoring the chat while you were talking there, Sherry. We had a couple of questions that came in about if you can plant, if you don't have a good ideal place to plant in the ground, if you could do blueberries in a raised bed or in a container, and if you could use potting soil. So my recommendation was that you could, as long as you had mended it to the proper pH, and I recommended maybe a little bit of peat moss in there and heavier on the peat moss side. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. And where I used to work, we had some blueberries grown in pots, but we did overwinter. We had some questions about overwintering pots, and it kind of depends on what you're dealing with. Blueberries need to be protected a little bit, even if it isn't a 5-gallon pot. We actually had a shelter that would basically an insulated shed where we would put strawberry plants in like 1-gallon containers, and we also put the blueberries in there. So that the temperature was kind of maintained around 32 degrees. And when we put them in there, we made sure that they were well watered. So you don't want to let things get dried out over the winter, but you also don't want them to be soggy wet, okay? And then we put row cover over top of them also to help insulate them. So if you're gonna overwinter pots, you need to insulate them somehow. You can do that by digging a hole and sticking them in the ground. You could cover them with mulch to several, a good mound over top of them. Those are a couple of suggestions. Do you have any other suggestions, Ashley, on protecting pots over winter?
Yeah, I like to, if nothing else, if you can just give them a windbreak, kind of like what you're saying, even if you can just put them up against the side of your house or a garage where they're going to be in the sunny side, something to get the wind off of the roots. It seems like in our area, that's usually what kills stuff is the cold, intense winds, because we don't have as much snow as we used to. So yeah, or an unheated garage, like you were saying, a shelter of some sort, that's really going to be useful.
Exactly. And somebody mentioned about bringing the pots inside. I wouldn't do that because remember, these plants need chilling hours. So in order for them to break dormancy and to produce fruit, and it's going to be too warm in your house for that. So definitely don't bring them inside. Like an unheated garage would be, pretty good, as long as it's not getting too warm. And be aware that as the springtime, warms up, the temperatures are going to get warmer in your garage too. And it might get warmer faster than it would outside. So then if you have to watch that too. You don't want to keep the plants inside too long either, because then they may produce buds for fruit. And then if you put them outside, the temperatures are too cold and then you lose your fruit. So a lot of things to consider.
Right. You want to give them care, but not too much care. Okay, we had another question about the late frosts that are being expected. We had a lady that was saying that a lot of her small fruits are already budding out, including raspberries and blueberries and grapes. Unfortunately, she asked if we had any advice of anything that could be done. And unfortunately, it's just been a weird kind of weather year. I mean, a weird year in a lot of ways, but weather too, with a lot of, warm weather early and now this cold snap. So you can do things like floating row cover over them. It's kind of unsightly and it's hard to keep on those things. But if it's going to get really, really cold, you could try that. You can also hope for a little bit of like rain or moisture that would maybe freeze the rain instead of the fruit the buds themselves. Sherry, do you have anything else you can think of?
No, it's just really difficult. So a row cover is only going to give you, depending on the thickness, a degree or two of protection. And you can try it, but there's just no taming Mother Nature. So the only other thing is that you can plant varieties that bear flowers later in the season so that you can avoid these late frosts. So things that need more chilling hours before they would put out buds.
Perfect. Okay. We have a few other questions we're going to hold till the end, I think. Let's go ahead. We're going to move on and talk a little bit about grapes. Grapes are another small fruit. The fruit itself is small, at least. The vines can get quite large. So we just put some general information in here. There are a couple different varieties, the same genus but different species. European wine grapes versus native fox grapes. The fox grapes are usually seeded or seeded varieties. These are going to be a little bit more hardy. And think of probably more ones that you're going to see natively, out in nature. So just a few things about grapes are they can be difficult to transplant. So you don't want to try to transplant a large vine once it's already established in one place. There are some ways that you can propagate them that makes, if you want to take a cutting or something like that, it's a little bit easier than trying to dig up a huge plant. They'll do a little bit better. So this is another plant that is considered to be perennial. It's a perennial crown that's going to stay there year after year after year. And then there's going to be different shoots that come off of there. The complicated thing about grapes are that they only produce fruit and flowers on wood that is at least 2 years old. So therefore, you have to be careful when we talk about pruning them. You don't want to prune them back, too far, because if you prune all of your 2-year wood or 1-year-old wood, you're not going to get any grapes the following season. Okay, so it gets a little bit complicated. We'll try to go over that a little bit again here in a minute. One of the worst things you can do is not prune your grapes, though. That tends to cause overcrowding, and you just have the plant can't produce or can't support that many flowers and fruit. So then you end up getting really poor quality fruit, and it's not as usable. So pruning is definitely a really important part of your grape management program. So one thing to note is that your grapes are a true berry, so the bees, they're not required for pollination on them either. So again, these are just some different varieties just for you to have for your notes and records. We're not going to go over them each individually. We are going to go down here and talk a little bit about the number one problem we see in backyard grape growers is something called black rot, which is a fungal disease. So if you've ever had these little mummy fruits, if you look at the picture on the right, that's the inoculum. That's usually where it overwinters. These little mummy grapes, they fall down to the bottom of the understory of the grape arbor, and that's where they're going to overwinter till the next season, and that's where the fungus stays. You'll see the picture on the left is what shows up on the leaves, and then the actual black rot on the grapes, which makes them unusable. So this is a fungal disease, as I said at the very beginning. So the treatment is a fungicide, helping to keep the canopy more open so more air can get in there. Is also a good management practice, and making sure you discard any of the fallen leaves that may have the inoculum or the fruit itself, the dried up mummies. So generally, you don't want to fertilize your grapes very much. The more you fertilize them can cause them to grow too much leafiness and not enough fruit. So unless you're having issues, you generally don't have to fertilize them, especially if you have a good bit of organic matter in your soil. So if you can add some layer of compost to the soil or something like that, that's your best bet. just like a lot of these other fruits that we've talked about, grapevines do require a good bit of water. So we say 1 inch of water per week. So that's kind of hard to imagine for most people. And I've found that with any type of containers especially, water is the #1 limiting factor in production and getting things to perform like you think they should. So an equivalent to 1 inch of water per week would be 6 gallons per square foot of growing for growing surface. So that's a good bit of water. So if you think about like, you know, a 5-gallon bucket, you probably need to be adding about 6 gallons per week of water to that situation. Okay, so grapes require a good bit of water, especially if it's going to be hot and dry. A little bit about harvesting. You know, remove the clusters. It's always they come off hard, so be sure that you have hand shears or a knife. And they can last a really long time in the refrigerator in like a perforated bag. You don't want the humidity to be too high for the grapes, but they can last. So that's a really nice feature of grapes. Some of the problems we see is that grapes are really sensitive to any type of herbicide. So if, you know, there's any drift from neighboring, you know, fields or, you know, utility poles or anything like that, if you're starting a grape orchard or a grape vineyard or just a grape, you know, a place where you're going to have your grapes in your yard, yeah, you do want to stay away from anywhere that could possibly have, you know, herbicide drift, because we will see that showing up on your grapevines. Okay. This was a list of cultivars that we found from a fact sheet from Iowa State. Just if you're, again, if you're looking for, you know, what varieties to look at, they've come up with a lot of new breeding for table grapes, which I think is exciting because, you know, who doesn't love to have fresh grapes, especially ones that would be seedless. So I really like this table, again, just for your reference, to have some idea of what you could grow. Concord are grapes that I grew up with for years and years. That's what we always had here on the farm. But again, they do have seeds in them, so they're not always the best for fresh eating. So we talk a little bit about pruning. Again, if you have grapevines, this is something you're probably going to want to study and become a little bit more clear on. But you have to make sure that the canes that came off of the perennial crown, so the first year that's going to come off, you don't want to prune that off. And then the second year on that cane are going to be shoots that come off, and that's where those the fruit clusters are actually going to be found for the following season. So you only want to have, you know, once they produce fruit, then they're not going to produce fruit again. So it really gets kind of complicated. If you guys have questions about it, the really important thing to know is that they only produce on 2-year wood, and once that, you know, cane or section produces, it's not going to produce again. Okay. The next slide I have is on some really underused small fruits that we wanted to mention that are just kind of fun. So Sherry, I will let you start with the ribes or the currants.
All right. So I actually grow currants. I enjoy them very much. I have black and red currants in my yard. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. Now, I don't particularly find these pleasant to eat
you need to turn
off
that off.
the vine. Okay. They are very sour. Okay. But I tell you what, the black currants make the best jam. The red currants, they kind of remind me of cranberries. And I freeze them and use them for making smoothies and all kinds of things. So let's get on with it. All right, so we've got currants and gooseberries. They're a very closely related species within the genus Ribes. Gooseberries have thorns while currants do not. They are long-lived perennial shrubs, and they're pretty cold hardy, some even down to zone 2. In general, these are small, compact shrubs that have a height and spread of about 3 to 6 feet. You may have heard of jostaberries and wondered what they are. Well, jostaberries are a cross between a gooseberry and a black currant, and that's what you get. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So we're going to talk about currants here. So most of the cultivated currants that you're going to plant are actually of European origin, although we called a strig. Your fruits may come in white, pink, red, or black. And as I mentioned, they're usually pretty tart. They're best used in jams and jellies and juices. They do have extremely high concentrations of vitamin C and some other nutrients. And they'll actually retain that vitamin C for even after 6 months in storage. And they can self-fertilize, but they will do better if you have other cultivars nearby. So more than one cultivar is best for fruit production. Okay, so blackcurrant nutrition with some surprises here. They have twice as much calcium as any fruit except blackberry. They've got more vitamin C than any other available fruit. I'm not so concerned about fat in fruits, but apparently they have less fat than other fruits except nectarines. They've got more phosphorus and potassium than any other fruit. And they're second only to elderberries in iron and protein. So it's pretty nutritious. And we have some nice pictures, so it gives you an idea of what these shrubs look like. They're actually very attractive to me. I think, especially with the red currants, it just looks like beautiful little red jewels hanging in the shrubs. So go ahead and go to the next slide there, Ashley. So you've got black, red, white, and pink. I haven't tried the white and pink, but I think they're supposed to be less acidic than the red for sure. Maybe a little sweeter. Go ahead with the next one. Okay, we're going to talk about gooseberries for a moment here. There's two major groups. You have European and North American. So the European varieties originated from North Africa and the Caucasus Mountains, and generally they are pea-sized to even as big as a small egg. Their color can come in green, yellow, white, pink, red, or purple, and they're not quite as hardy as the North American varieties. Now, the North American varieties are hardy, they're disease resistant, however, they tend to be smaller and don't taste as good. So what breeders have done is they've crossed the two to get the characteristics of both, so you have the best of both worlds. And so there's some new cultivars out there that are sweet and also have tender skins and have pretty good disease resistance and cold hardiness. And so here we see an example of the European variety, and you'll see the species name, which would be Ribes graciolaria variety uva crispa, or the American, which would be Ribes hirtatum. All right, and go to the next one. In general, you'll find that red currants and gooseberries only take 3 to 4 years to maturity, whereas black currants from the time you plant them might need 4 or 5 years. And they're fairly long-lived shrubs. They are adapted to cooler climates. So if you're someplace hot, first you want to check your hardiness zones and see if they're going to do all right there. But if it tends to be hotter, you might actually want to plant these in part shade, and they might fare a little better. Just make sure they have adequate water, and basically you just want to fertilize them in the spring. As you see, they're starting to put out buds and flowers. It would be a good time to fertilize, and birds can be a problem with them. I have a catbird that kind of hangs out in my yard every spring waiting to get the currant, so I have to cover my currant bushes with either bird netting or a very thin row cover, but I do that after the flowers have finished flowering and have dropped. So they require 1,000 to 1,200 hours of chilling before they're going to break dormancy. So they may not do that well, too far south. In fact, they probably won't. And something that you may not be familiar with is that gooseberries and currants, mostly currants, can have a problem with a disease called white pine blister rust, which is a really interesting disease, kind of a complicated disease. Now, if your shrubs don't have this or do have this disease, it won't kill your shrubs, but it will actually kill the alternate host, which are white pines or any kind of pine that has 5 needles in a cluster. And the way that this disease works is that the fungus starts out on the white pines and it releases spores in the springtime, which then find a ribes plant, gooseberry or currant, and they make their home there. And then they produce more spores, which then reinfect those ribes plants and others in the region. And then those then produce spores again towards the end of the summer, which then are going to be carried by the wind back to the pine trees nearby. And this disease actually does kill white pines, and that is why for a while the federal government banned growing gooseberries throughout the country. Now that ban has been lifted, but each state or maybe even counties may have their own ordinances about whether or not you can grow currants, mostly gooseberries not so much, but the black currants tend to be more susceptible to this disease than any of the others. Now there are some resistant varieties of black currants out there, so I suggest that first check your local ordinances to see if you can grow it, and if you can, then choose the ones that are most disease resistant. One would be Consort, and I grow Benseric, which is not quite as disease resistant, but it does have some disease resistance. Okay, go ahead, Ashley.
All right. So the last small fruit that we wanted to talk to you about is something called elderberries. So this is a fun one that has gotten a lot of, I think, press or a lot of coverage here in the last couple of years. Especially this year, I've seen a lot of touted health benefits from elderberry syrup. So I just really wanted to touch on this one just kind of as something fun, something for you to think about adding. So it is, the scientific name is genus and species Sambucus nigra, and there's different subspecies. This one in particular pictured as canadensis, and this would be our native elderberry that we have here on the East Coast. So these were once so common that people called them a ditchweed, which I think is very interesting. Unfortunately, a lot of them have died off. I know here in my area, I grew up helping my dad pick elderberries because he loves elderberry jelly, and we just don't have them here like we used to for some reason, whether it's the change in climate or change in management practices or what it is. But they are easily spread once you get them started. Again, they have these perennial type of crowns, and then they put up these new shoots each season. They can spread, they can go anywhere in height from 6 to 16 feet, and they can spread pretty much that distance as well once they get to be in a happy location. So they're just kind of fun. One thing I really like about them is that they have these really pretty berries on them, these berry clusters, which can also not only be used to eat or edible, at least the juice of them are to make a lot of jams and jellies. Again, they're very, very, very tart, but they can also be used for dye. So if you're interested in doing any type of dyeing, they're where it's at because they're very a strong dye. The one thing you might be interested in is that butterflies and birds love them. More than 48 different species of birds will come and eat them. So if you're trying to attract birds or other, critters for your native plants or native birds and that sort of thing, elderberry would be a great thing to get established on your property. Relatively pest-free. You don't have to do a whole lot of work to them. Sometimes the dead canes you'll have to thin out. Again, when they grew in the wild, we never had to do any of that. They kind of just take care of themselves. It can take, up to 3 to 4 years to get a really nice healthy hedge if you're trying to put them in a place like that. But they're just kind of really fun. Again, you're not going to go up to these berries and pick them off raw. you're going to have to do some cooking before they're going to be edible. And you can only eat the ones that are completely colored, like the black color. You can't eat them when they're green. I think they're considered to be poisonous then. So one of the things I found in the research when I was putting this presentation together was that you can actually use the flowers and fry them like you do a squash flower. So dip them in batter and fry them. So that might be something different to try if you're looking for, something to fool your friends or relatives with. So I just put a little bit more about site selection. They can grow pretty much anywhere. They have a fibrous root system. So again, soil that's going to be fairly, deep topsoil is going to make them happy. They can grow where it's wet as long as it's not standing water. They can take up to, some moisture on their feet. That's where we used to always grow, where they always grew wild here was, near the swampy land. So I think they do okay there. So that's all I had about elderberries, just something fun. Again, not something that you're gonna probably see in a lot of people's yards or gardens, but if you're looking for something new and a conversation piece, I actually got some seeds from a native seed company a couple years ago, and I grew some from seed, and it was surprising at how easy they were to propagate from seed. So just something to think about. Sherry, you have anything to add to that? If not, we can wrap up with questions. I know some people are adding them to the chat box. We had one a while ago about kiwis, and I'll have to get back to you. I don't have a whole lot of knowledge about growing kiwis. Sherry, do you have anything you want to say about that?
What was the question? Let me see.
Yeah. Would you please give advice for growing kiwi? I've had one male and female plant on my deck for 5+ years. Healthy, but haven't had any fruit.
Okay, yeah, I'm not up on kiwi. I just know a little bit about it, but I do know that it can be a tremendous vine if you don't keep it in check. And other than that, and that you need a male and a female, I forget what you need to do about pruning, because I think there may be some pruning techniques that are important in order to get them to fruit, but I definitely can look that up, and we could try and send you some information. Ashley, do we have a way to get Renee's email?
Yes, I have her email. We can follow up with her. Yes. Yeah, we can follow up with her later.
Okay, we'll follow up with you, Renee.
Okay, yep. The other question, one of them was, I just lost it, I apologize. Elderberries, yeah, they're definitely not going to be one that you can grow in a container. They need a pretty extensive area for their roots to spread, so I would stay away from those if you can. Okay, Sherry, this one might be one you can help with. Are there any berries that are not as attractive to deer and bears? Any tips for keeping the critters away?
Oh man.
Yeah, that's a hard one.
That's a hard one. Yeah. I'm trying to think if there is anything out there that deer wouldn't eat. But I think all of these things that we've talked about, they will. I don't know about grapes, but basically you just have to work on excluding deer in your yard in general. Of course, having a dog that roams your yard is always a plus. We have one, and she has a shot collar to stay within the electric fence, and she does that, and it helps to keep deer out of my yard, but not everybody can do that. You may have to put up a 7-foot fence around your plants to keep the deer out. You can apply some deer repellents. There's a wide variety of deer repellents out there that you can spray your plants with. Everything from rotten egg smell to coyote urine. There's all kinds of things out there. The thing is, you have to repeat spray after it rains. It's going to wash it off, so you have to keep up with that. And also, you might not like the smell yourself, so you have to consider that. Sometimes people will hang up little bags full of was it milorganite? Is that how you say that? It's kind of like Yeah, it's a kind of fertilizer that's from sewage that you can put around your plants, and the deer don't like that smell either. Um, what else would be? Well, electric fence, of course, but that's a lot of expense. But yeah, you can put up electric fence and bait the fence to keep the deer and the bear out.
Yeah, exclusion is definitely probably your
Yeah.
best bet. You can also do, you know, not so elaborate things, just like if you have a currant bush, you can just do deer fence right around the currant bush, you know, or something smaller. Unfortunately, like Sherry said, it's just keeping them out is the hardest part. Okay, we're getting some
Yeah.
questions.
I mean, you can cover your fruit. I'm sorry. I was just going to add, you can cover your fruit with row cover after it's bloomed, and that's an actual physical barrier, you know, that would keep critters off of it.
Okay. Sherry, do you know how far apart you have to keep currants from white pine? Is there a foot?
About 1,500 feet.
1,500 feet, okay.
But just because you have white pines nearby doesn't mean you're going to have the disease, because I have neighbors that are probably close to that, that have some white pines, and I've never had an issue. So just because you have white pines and currants in the same place does not mean you're going to have the disease. It just means it's possible.
All right. Okay, we're getting some questions on pawpaw. Sherry, I don't have any information right off the top of my head that I can share on pawpaws, about, do we need more than one? Was one question, do you need a pair?
Okay, I know a little bit about pawpaws. With pawpaws, you need to have more than one plant, okay, and they need to not be genetically identical. So basically, you need to have two plants, okay, and they cannot be the same, have the same genetics, which means basically get a couple of cultivars if you're going to order them online, because otherwise you won't get pollination and you won't get fruit to develop. Judd, I can't remember his first name, but there's Mr. Judd. He lives in Frederick. He does a lot of permaculture stuff, and he's actually has a book out about how to grow pawpaw. And I think that's a great resource for you if you want to. You can Google that. I can step out and look for his name, or I could look it up online while Ashley's talking about something. But that's probably about the extent of my knowledge on pawpaws.
Yeah, and that's a great lead-in, Sherry, to you know, there's wonderful, wonderful extension fact sheets out there. So if you guys are familiar with searching for topics on small fruit, if you just put the word extension and put the word PDF in there, the letters PDF, in your search engine as well, with whatever fruit or vegetable that you want to look up, it's a great way to get wonderful, wonderful guides and resources. You know, feel free to reach out to either Sherry or I individually. Our emails are going to be, again, included in the follow-up that I send you with the PowerPoint slides. So you can always reach out to either one of us individually, or on the very first slide, we also had our email addresses. I can put that back up here for you guys to write them down. But Sherry is sfrick@umd.edu, and I'm abigthel@umd.edu. So please feel free to reach out to us with any individual questions that we might have missed, or anything like that. All right, and with that,
Absolutely.
I think that we're going to go ahead and wrap up. If anybody has further questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Sherry, thank you again, everyone, for joining, and Sherry, I'll let you have the floor.
Okay, yeah, it's been great. I'm so glad to have so many people join us today, and I'd be glad to answer any of your questions. I don't know if you noticed in the chat, but someone asked if where they could see this webinar at a later time. So I mentioned that the University of Maryland Extension Western Cluster has a YouTube channel, and that's where this video will be posted to. And with that, I think that's...
We have a couple poll questions if you're still on. We want to just get you to answer a couple quick polls for us. We're going to launch the first one now. If you don't mind, go ahead and answer those real quick. Give people just a few more minutes here. And then we have 2 other questions if you're still on with us. Okay. So the question was, as a result of this workshop, I intend to, and several people do plan to start a new fruit garden. So thank you so much for telling us that. We have 2 more polls. If you would go ahead and answer this one. As a result of this workshop, I increased my gardening skills. All right, and I have one. And we have one last one if you're still here with us. All right, folks. All right, well, again, we just want to thank you all for sticking with us and for, hanging in and learning a little bit about small fruit with us, okay? And with that, I guess we will go ahead and end the recording and close out the meeting. Thanks again.
Thank you.